leaders in the last 20 years of this particular opposition to the Bible and the destruction of people's faith in the Bible has come from these particular fellows, particularly Christopher Hitchens, Dave Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris. And you might notice the media puts them under the heading of the Four Horsemen. We know, of course, that is a steal from the Bible, but the media has done this to signify the damage that they have done on religion and belief in God. And they certainly have been incredibly effective. They've written millions of books, made many YouTube posts and many other sites out there that people can go to, and they pick up the vitriol from these guys against the Bible. You mightn't have read their books, you mightn't even heard of these fellows, but I can tell you, you have for sure witnessed the impact that they've had upon the values of society around you. It's why today Bible ignorance is widespread. In fact, the other day I was listening to a gardening program on the radio, and they have a quiz that goes through the program. And it took 10 callers before anyone could actually name the first four Gospels. And I was astounded at the ignorance of the population. A tremendous loss of Christian ethics in society. God is challenged and judged by modern values. Religion around us is in great decline. And sadly to say, we have lost a lot of our brethren and sisters, and particularly our young people, as they grow up in a world where there is so much criticism aimed at the Bible. And these are some of the books, and all of them have a whole series of books, but these are some of the books which have infected society. And it's got through to the media, it's got through to academia, it's part of political life. And in general, what they have done is to create a biblically ignorant population. And of course, it just was the breeding ground for today's generation of the woke society and the cancel culture and all those things that we're now facing. So these are the people that have led the criticism of the Bible. We're going to talk particularly about Richard Dawkins, who's the leading skeptic. He's the man that goes around, he wrote the book, The God Delusion. He goes around the UK, or he used to go around the UK with his bus with the sign, "There's probably no God." And funnily enough, he has a bit of a problem with saying there is no God, because he just can't explain things like DNA. And so he has to say, well, maybe spacemen brought it here. So he says, there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And that's the old eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow you die philosophy. So he's one of the leading skeptics. This is what he said, and this is the basis of our title. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, which is against women, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, and all these other words I can hardly pronounce, which he applies to the God of heaven. And if ever anyone was setting themselves up for a confrontation with God, it's this man. And you can see that when that sort of language is used about the God that we believe and love, then you can see what an impact that has upon society. And this is the wicked construction that these people put on God. So today we're going to deal with this ethnic cleansing and the slavery and so forth, but we can't deal with all of it in one session, but we'll deal with it in other times. Christopher Hitchens, now deceased. God has all these unalterable laws. The forgotten Canaanites were pitilessly driven out of their homes to make room for the ungrateful and useless children of Israel. You can see the emotional way that this is presented, that the poor Canaanites were driven out. Then we have this trafficking in humans, ethnic cleansing, slavery, bride price, indiscriminate massacres, and so forth. And again, it comes back to criticising the source of the Bible, saying that it was put together by crude, uncultured human animals. And you can get the flavour very quickly that these people have actually slandered the Bible incredibly. This is Sam Harris. My book is designed to demolish the intellectual and moral pretensions of Christianity in its most committed forms. And I guess we would come into that class of the most committed. And, you know, these books have been aimed at undermining the faith in the God of the Bible. And he goes on to say we should be stoning people for heresy, adultery, etc. And of course, this is classic extremist language. So summarising the new atheist challenge before we get on to answering it, they deny the existence of God, and they support evolution, obviously. They proclaim religion as the major cause of evil throughout history, and this is one of the great themes of Christopher Hitchens. He makes a lot of cases about how many wars and how many massacres and how many disasters can be tied back to religion. And of course, we're not here to defend all religion, because many of those things are true. The Catholic persecutions on their own are a terrible blot upon history of the world. So we're not here to justify other religions, but we are here to actually say that God is not guilty of the things they accuse him of. And they accuse him of being a disgraceful, bullying child abuser. You know, he had to offer, he went to offer his son Isaac, and of course they believe that Isaac was about 12 years old when he was probably 33, and cooperated with his father. But again, you can just see the emotive language that is put forward, that they might follow their own lusts. So these are the issues. A jealous God who allows no other gods, a God who demands constant praise and worship, repressive and discriminatory laws about women and approving the sale of daughters as brides, and we do have sessions that we could do sometime in the future on those. The genocide of the Canaanites, slavery is allowed and condoned, racism because the privileged treatment of the Jews, harsh punishments for supposedly minor crimes, the death penalty for adultery and homosexuals, and they would, of course, say that God's morals are completely out of date today. And I would guess that most of us would be thinking to ourselves, look, we don't have any problem with any of those things. We can understand the God of the Bible. But these concepts are very deceptive. And you're probably aware of this brother that was an Australian who very publicly resigned from the Brotherhood a few years ago. And he said this week I resigned from the Christadelphian faith after 30 years. And this is a brother that used to teach at study weekends and Bible schools. I resigned because I no longer believe in God. I'm not sure there is a God. Perhaps there is, but he is not who I once thought he was. And that's the critical statement. As if God has somehow changed, or is it that the brother has come to think differently about God? And of course, that's where it comes from. He's now thinking about God through the eyes of the modern world. Yes, there was some wisdom in the Bible. The attitudes to women and foreigners it describes, sometimes commands, were not worthy of the God I once believed in. And you can actually see how that God is now being rejudged by modern values. And that's coming from an intelligent, highly educated Christadelphian. And it just shows you how easily we can be deceived. But what I think is important is that we actually give to our younger people some real answers to these criticisms that they will inevitably face as they come in contact with the world around them. So we need to take the law of Moses in context first. When you think about it, it was written against a background of existing ancient cultures and moral codes. And we can say unreservedly the law of Moses was far, far superior than all the ancient moral codes. It did not allow for a class system. It had kings that were subject to God and to the people. It had situations where women were treated very, very well compared to the ancient world in which they lived. It had situations like the world's first welfare system, where there was provision for the poor and needy and the widows and the fatherless and the strangers. It had fantastic provisions against serious crimes. So it was a fantastic law, and especially when you compare it to the ancient world in which it was given. But it was given for an immature nation. They were rescued slaves. They lacked initiative. They needed strict moral codes, strict organisational codes, civil law, and a form of worship that they might become an effective working nation where people could live in peace and harmony. And so there had to be laws, there had to be codes, and there had to be government. But it was so different to what was around them. When you go to the ancient codes of the world, there was torture, there was mutilation, there was slavery, class distinctions, witchcraft, and absolutely no rights or respect for women. And the law of Moses was so different to all of those things. Sometimes the law comes under criticism because it actually gets into issues such as theft and divorce, things like this. And it's not that God ever wanted those things to happen, but he knew that they would. And so he regulated around those things with the laws that he gave. And that sometimes needs to be understood, that sometimes God is not saying, do this. He's saying, I know you will do it because of the hardness of your hearts. And here's what happens in those cases. And of course, we can look at the law of Moses through some of the expositions of the New Testament as well. So we can see the law of Moses in its context. But let's just take some of the quick ones first. Is God a demanding God who demands soul worship? Well, absolutely yes on that score. And while that might not be acceptable in the modern world for anyone to say that I demand to be worshipped, it's certainly true with the creator of the heavens and the earth. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul and with all your might. And these are the words I command you this day. And God requires that he is served singly and not in competition with some other God in our life. And particularly not with the idols of wood and stone that men have worshipped down through the centuries. And so God does demand soul worship. Absolutely, yes, he does. Is he jealous and demanding? Yes, he is. He says in Exodus 34, you shall worship no other God. My name is jealous. I'm a jealous God. He says the same thing over and over again in a lot of different contexts. And so God is certainly a God that, because he is the creator, he does require singular obedience from mankind. So again, if that's a problem with the modern world, then they perhaps are out of step with reality. But God who created has the right to demand soul worship. And he's still a jealous God. When you go to the New Testament, Paul says, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And we can't share the fellowship of God with the table of demons, with different attitudes that are out there. And we've got to make sure that our fellowship is kept so that we don't provoke God to jealousy. And we don't share our worship with anyone but the Father himself. So God is still a jealous God, and that's even the New Testament saying the same. Okay, well, let's come to the charge of racism. According to the modern principles, that God choosing one nation and working almost solely with them for a couple of thousand years would be regarded as racist. And God's still today saying that Israel, his chosen people, is regarded as racist. And it's incredible that people think they can actually put that sort of title on God, who made all things, who created all the nations, who gave them the boundaries of their existence, who gave them the time periods that they would exist. And God, who's in control of all nations, can do what he likes with the nations. And yes, he did choose Israel above all the nations. He did that to show his power and glory. There was a purpose in having a witness in the earth. He made promises he'd made to Abraham had to be kept by making the children of Israel that great nation that they would become. And they would have to show the virtues of God to the world, which is, unfortunately, they largely failed him. But that was the object of God working with that one nation. Jesus Christ, when he came, was a Jew born into that nation, and he will be King of the Jews in the age to come. God will finally bless all nations, but in the end, it will be through the hope of Israel. And God has chosen Israel to be his avenue for people to come to the gospel that will save. And in the kingdom, we know that Israel will be highly respected amongst the nations. So again, if that's racism, then let the modern world say so. But God is not racist. God is the creator. God makes the nations. God sets the nations in their place. And God has the prerogative to choose one nation to be his witness in the earth. So we come to this matter of this prerogative of the creator. And this is what people will not accept. When God chose Israel, he said to them, you shall not walk in the manners of the nation which I cast you up before you. That's just the Canaanites. They committed all these things and I abhorred them. But I've said unto you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I am Yahweh your God, which have separated you from other people. And later on he says, I have severed you from other people, that you should be mine. And God has this prerogative, and it's the same today. God, in the age of the Gentiles receiving the gospel, God is still separating a small little flock for himself, a few that he intends to give the first fruits of the kingdom to. And so God does have this prerogative to choose for his own. He is not yet saving all men. He would have all men to be saved, but he's not yet saving all men until we get into the kingdom, when everybody will hear the gospel of the age. And God has this prerogative to pick and choose those with whom he will work. And we cannot go to the creator and say, you cannot do this because it doesn't meet modern standards. This is the creator's prerogative. Okay, well, let's come to the annihilation of the Canaanites, which is portrayed by Hitchens and others as being a terribly cruel act, that God dispossessed these poor Canaanites and let Israel take over their land. Well, let's never forget we're dealing with the God of the Bible. You cannot get past Genesis chapter 6, and we find that the God of the Bible is going to obliterate 2 billion people approximately. And everybody in that, except one family, was drowned. And that included men, women, children, animals, everything. And the Creator has the right to do that. In the case of the Canaanites, when God spoke to Abraham in Genesis 15, he said, look, the iniquity of the Canaanites is mounting up, and it's mounting up. They're becoming more and more evil. And when it's come to the full, they will be displaced. And God gave them 440 years to repent. And it's just amazing, isn't it, that God's mercy should be so long-suffering towards those Canaanites. But as we know from the records of the archaeologists and those who've gone into these things, eventually the Canaanite religion was so utterly depraved, right through every level of the family, that even the children were corrupted. And if you haven't read it before, I recommend you grab hold of Rotherham's and read the section at the front of Rotherham's translation, which actually talks about why the Canaanites had to be destroyed. And you can get a very clear idea that their whole religion was based upon not only total immorality being involved in these things, but of course the offering of children to their gods. And so, it was a vile religion in many ways. And so it was corrupted to the point that God could no longer bear with them. And at that time, Israel came in, and he told them that they must get rid of every vestige of the Canaanite religion, every one of the Canaanites, all of their idols, all of their statues, all of their worship places, all of their groves. It all had to go. And it was to be a total and utter extermination. So yes, God did command the genocide of the Canaanites and later on of the Amalekites. And it's not surprising. The Amalekites were a moral and physical threat to Israel for many, many years. And God made them a type of all those who are anti-Semitic. But why did God command it? Well, this is what God said later on to Israel in the law of Moses. It wasn't because they were more righteous than the Canaanites at that time. It's not because they were the best people God could find. God said, the reason that you're going in is because of the wickedness of those nations that I'm driving them out for before you. And also because I promised this land to your fathers. And God always keeps his promises. And, he made it very clear to Israel that they were not to get carried away, that they were anything better than the Canaanites. And of course they were, but not to say it was because of their righteousness that God had to give them the land. God says, it's not because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. But the real reason I'm giving you this land is that I've had enough of these Canaanites in this territory and they've got to go. And God has the prerogative to remove wickedness when it exists in the earth. So God did require the absolute extermination of the Canaanites and their vile religion. Absolutely no doubt about it. No exceptions allowed. Even the young children were corrupt at a very early age. And so God says, they all have to go. But God didn't say to Israel, I want you to go out and conquer other nations and take more territory and make your country bigger. God said, you go to the land that I give you, and then if nations around you are willing to live at peace, then you can live at peace with them. You don't have to go and take on every other nation. And so they didn't invade the Ammonites and the Moabites with the view of genocide with them. We know later on, of course, the Ammonites and the Moabites attacked Israel and they had to defend themselves. But they were not required to go and to keep on taking new territory. It was that they were to replace the Canaanites and to remove them totally and utterly. So it's very clear that there was a reason for the extermination of the Canaanites. So answering the question, does God approve genocide? Well, yes, for the Canaanites and the Amalekites, Saul was told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And even just keeping one man alive was a sin. So that was because they were a moral and physical threat to God's nation of Israel, and they had to go. God didn't require Israel to destroy other nations around them who were peaceable. And people who think that genocide of this nature is unreasonable and irrational and out of step with modern values, they're going to have a great shock when Christ comes, and we know that the wicked will be removed from the earth. It says in Psalm 37, you shall look for the place of the wicked, and it shall not be. So Proverbs 2 says that the transgressor shall be rooted out of the earth. And Psalm 58, verse 10 and 11 says, the righteous shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked, and say, truly there is a reward for the righteous, as the wicked are trampled underfoot. And there's going to be another removal of the wicked when Christ returns, because God requires that wickedness to be taken away and everything that it pertains to it, as he did with the Canaanites in time past. So yes, God does approve genocide. God does approve the removal of the wicked. And there's going to be more of that in the age to come. So again, we can't let the world poison our minds that somehow God was a God of genocide because he destroyed certain nations through Israel. And now we come to the matter of slavery, which is the main point of our topic today. Slavery occurred back in the 1800s because there was great profit in getting cheap labor for the cotton fields of America and for the sugar plantations in the West Indies that were run by the British and the Dutch. And what happened was that a system developed whereby Africans and particularly Arabs would round up the natives in the jungles of Africa and the villages of Africa, put them in chains and take them down to the coast. They would be transported on horrendous British and Dutch ships across the Atlantic to America and the West Indies. And they were used to enrich the slave owners of the Americans and the British, particularly in those sugar plantations in the West Indies. And so a tremendous slave trade developed, and it was an immoral, it was a horrendously cruel and vicious trade, driven by money. And here is the Arabs and the Africans rounding up their fellow countrymen, taking them down to the coast to be put on slave ships. And those slave ships were incredibly cruel, incredibly crowded, full of disease and filth. And it was a nasty experience for people who had only ever lived in African jungle countries. And it was a disgraceful trade. We know what happened when they go to America. They were then auctioned off to slave owners, and they became totally property, working in many times 7 days a week from dawn till dusk. What is amazing is that a lot of Christians in America and England justified this slavery by using passages from the Bible and saying, well, look, it was there in the Old Testament, we're just doing the same thing. There was slavery in the New Testament, where disciples were told to remain as slaves in the Roman Empire. And so they used the Bible to justify the horrible slave trade that took place in America and in the West Indies. And we've got to look at this because the skeptics would charge God with condoning slavery and say, look, God allowed slavery to happen. God told them they could buy and sell people. And it's just not true. And when you look at what the Bible has to say, the Bible is absolutely clear that the sort of slavery that existed in the 17 and 1800s is totally foreign to what God ever allowed Israel to do. It was totally banned in God's law. And what is remarkable, the law of Moses was the first time ever in human history that servants were treated as people and not property. And we're going to see that as we go through our understanding of how service was treated in the Old Testament. But let's make it clear, the sort of slavery that took place in taking people from their homes in Africa across the Atlantic into unpaid forced slavery is exactly what the Bible said must never, never happen. This is what we read in Exodus 21, verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So the Bible is absolutely clear that you cannot kidnap people, force them to be slaves, and own those slaves and on-sell those slaves. And it's just terrible the way this was justified from the Bible. And the same thing in Deuteronomy 24, verse 7. It's clear that God would not ever allow slavery of that kind to happen. So this is Deuteronomy 24. Absolutely no kidnapping was allowed. If a man be found stealing any of his brethren of the children of Israel and maketh merchandise of him or selleth him, then that thief shall die. You shall put away evil from among you. And so again, that the whole principle of buying or selling people was totally wrong. Servants cannot be harmed or treated violently. You could never mutilate them. You couldn't brown them. You know what happened in America when a slave would try and run away. They would set after them with bounty hunters and dogs. And if you ever read Alex Haley's Roots, you get some idea of what happened to them. But, they were mutilated. If they ran away a couple of times, then they would have their toes cut off to make it harder. And it was just absolutely inhumane what they did to those slaves. and the way that they were owned for life by the slave owner. And, you know, God said, look, you can't do that. You can't hurt, you can't mutilate your slaves, you can't brand your slaves and runaways from other nations. If a slave escaped from another nation and came to Israel, they could not be hunted down and they could not be returned to their master, because in those countries there was no protection for slaves. They would be punished when they were taken back, and you couldn't go and sell them back for a reward. And so you had to take them into Israel and treat them as a stranger was treated, which was very, very well. So again, God was looking after slaves and totally forbade the children of Israel from getting involved in the slave trade. Now, we need to understand that we've got to get our Old Testament terms correct, because in the Old Testament, it talks about service. It does not talk about slavery of the kind that America and then Britain sponsored in those years. There were three types of servitude that the law of Moses described, and we'll go through these in a bit more detail one by one. But we noticed that the first group were what we call the Hebrew brethren, who got into debt. Now, it says in Deuteronomy 15, verse 12, if a Hebrew brother be sold unto thee, and that's not a great translation. What it really means, if he actually gets into debt and you take over his debt, so he actually becomes your debtor, you take over his debt, you pay off his fine, whatever it was. So we have the first group is Hebrew brethren who got into debt. Maybe there was failure on their farm, maybe there was a disease went through their farm, maybe there was an accident on their farm, maybe they've been given a fine for some crime they committed and they can't pay it. So they come and work for you for a given period of time. And it can be for anything from 1 year to 6 years that they would come. And that the idea was that they would work to pay off their debt. An inheritance could be sold, or, you know, as we would say, mortgaged. If you got into really bad strife on your particular inheritance, then you could actually hand that over to somebody else for a time. If you were extremely poor, you would work as a servant on the property. Somebody else's capital would keep that farm going, and that would go on to the year of Jubilee, when again you would resume full rights to your property. So number one category is Hebrew brethren who got themselves into debt, who needed to work to pay off their debts, or who had to mortgage their inheritance for a time. And that's really not much different to most of us. So when we buy a house, we go into debt and we take out a mortgage and we have to pay it off over time, and we have to work to make sure we can pay that off. So the first one was Hebrew brethren working for Hebrews to pay off debts. The second category were the foreigners from outside Canaan. And when they had to fight against a nation outside of Canaan, and they took captives in those battles, those people could be spared death if they were willing to become servants in Israel. So you could bring them back into Israel and they would be servants for you. So here were people that would have been otherwise killed or perhaps left to starve after the battle, who now become workers in Israel, and they are treated as servants. We're going to see a bit later how well they were treated as servants. But they were people who would be able to live and to work in Israel. There were other people who were exiles or immigrants from other countries. They might have had to leave their country because of strife there or famine, and they've come in from other countries. They can't own Jewish land because the land belongs to God and he gives it as inheritances to his people. But they choose to stay there, and they have to work for their living, which again is no different to any of us. But these are foreigners who've come in and they work for their living. Interestingly, that the Gibeonites came under the provision of number 2. They convinced Joshua that they were genuinely from another country, a far off country, and so they became servants in Israel. And we know that the wonderful thing about the Gibeonites was that very likely they became the Nethinims, or the servants to the Levites, and they became a very significant part of the worship of Israel in times to come. So there were people who actually came back and became servants to Israel willingly. When you come to the third category, there was a small group of what we call foreign servants who had been bought from the Gentiles. So you might need a particular skill. You might need a stonemason for your business. You might need somebody who's very good at leatherwork or pottery or from another place. And you could go to a foreign country and you could buy a person whose skills you needed and bring them into Israel. And then they would come under the provisions of service in Israel. Now, this was generally a great advantage to that person. They might have been a 24/7 slave in the country they were in. They might have been treated very badly. When they came to Israel, there were tremendously good conditions and protections for servants. But they were your property. You paid for them. So if somebody's ox, actually destroyed that servant, and it was an ox that was known to be dangerous, then there was a price put on that. And it was interesting. The price was 30 pieces of silver. And there's a whole terrific lesson hidden behind that. But because they were something you had paid for, they did have a value. But you couldn't on-sell them. And that's an important thing. They couldn't be treated like a chattel you could on-sell. So you had bought their service and you'd paid for it and they were your property only as far as you treated them well. So when we come to Deuteronomy 15, we have what we call the poor laws. And this is where God provided for those who would be poor. And as we know, Jesus said, the poor you have with you always. And this chapter is based on the same principle, that there will always be people who find it hard to manage their finances. There are some people who just are not good at managing a farm. And what God did said that no matter where you are in Israel, whether you're a good manager or a bad manager, a good businessman and not good a businessman, whether you're a widow or the fatherless or a stranger, you will be provided for. And God's law was remarkable. It actually did everything it could to allay the problem of poverty. There was a fair tithing principle. No smart accountants to have bottom of the harvest schemes where you can get out of paying taxes. No having tax havens in the Bahamas or things like that. You had to pay, and it was every person had to pay 10% of what they produced. And so there was a very fair and reasonable taxation system. In our society, we tax some of the rich, 70, 80%, and poor people don't get taxed at all. But everybody had to pay 10%. And that created the world's first welfare system. It secured inheritances. God said that you can never sell your inheritance forever. And the desire was that every family would look after their inheritance and produce on it to provide for themselves and their neighbours. And God encouraged generosity and care for others. And so we have what we call the poor laws here in Deuteronomy 15. And it was necessary because people's fortunes differ and people differ in their enterprise, their wisdom, their application. And there are people who make bad decisions and ended up having financial consequences for them. So God says there will always be the poor and you have to provide for them. Some people might have become poor through illness, early death in the family, failed crops, or just can't handle money. And some had fines to work off. And if you're in debt and you can't pay it, then you have to work for somebody else. And I'm sure we understand that's how life operates. And people are very different as to what they can manage. So here we are faced with a situation of people working off their debts. But also, before we get to that, I want you to notice in Deuteronomy 15, the terms that God uses about looking after the poor. In verse 7, if there be among you a poor from any of thy brethren in thy gates, in the land which Yahweh thy God giveth thee, you shall not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand. And the NIV has, you should not be tight-fisted, which is a brilliant description of what it is. You shall not shut thine hand from thy poor brother. You shall open your hand wide to him, which is, of course, the contrary thing, and surely lend him sufficient for his need for that which he wanteth. So they had to actually, when somebody was in a desperate financial situation, they had to be prepared to take them in as a worker and to pay off their debts. And you were not allowed, as the law goes on to say, you're not allowed to calculate, oh, look, the year of release is close. I might not get my money back out of this. They weren't allowed to think like that. And in verse 9, beware there is no thought in your wicked heart. The 7th year is close. So you might say, look, the work I'm going to get out of this guy in the next couple of years isn't going to pay off the debt. And God says you can't be like that. You can't have an evil eye. An evil eye is where you're narrowly looking at somebody and calculating. You can't be like that, says God. You've got to give him what he needs. Otherwise, it'll be a sin unto you. And your heart shall not be grieved. And it was a very difficult thing for the Jews who've always had a problem with money, that they had to say, look, it doesn't really matter if I don't get paid off. And you know, these terms about your heart not being grieved and opening your hand wide would have been impossible for the legalist in the Jewish nation. But God says there will be a need for service because some people will be poor and some people will be in debt. And God regulated how that service would occur. So this is Leviticus 25, and this is particularly in relation to the law of inheritances and the Jubilee year. But the principles of service, Hebrew to Hebrew, are critical. If your brother that dwells by thee is waxen poor and be sold unto thee, and again, that idea of being sold, it means he's gone into your debt. You shall not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as a hired servant and as a sojourner. So he gets the same treatment as the man that you've bought from a foreign country to be a hired servant. As a sojourner, he's with you unto the year of Jubilee. Then he can go back, and he and his children with him, and go to his own family, back to his own inheritance. And God says the reason that you're not to compel him as a bondservant or as a slave, you can't treat him like a slave because you were slaves in Egypt, and you cannot sell your brethren to serve as bondmen. And you can't rule over them with rigor. And it says that 3 times in Leviticus 25, you must not rule with rigor. You can't treat them harshly. And this, of course, is so foreign to the American English slavery of the 18th century. So did God allow slavery for Hebrews? Absolutely no. What he had was servitude for Hebrews. And when a man's in debt, he can't pay off his fine, he's got to work it off. And then comes the year of release. Every 7th year, or in the case of a mortgage property, every 50th year, then the man would be released from the rest of his debt and he would go back to his own inheritance. You can look through the history of the world in every code, ancient or modern, you will never ever find a thing like the year of release and the year of Jubilee where existing mortgages and unpaid debts are cancelled. It just shows you the generosity of the God of Israel in comparison to all the other ancient codes that actually exacted the last penny. In God's economy, there was a time when everybody who was in debt could be forgiven of the remainder. And it was laying the foundations for grace that God forgives us when we don't deserve it. So servants had to be treated well or they were released. It says in Exodus 21, if you hit your servant and you cause them physical damage, they can walk out and the debt is cancelled. And you can see that if that's the case, then you're not going to start thrashing your servant, beating your servant, or treating them harshly. Because God says if you treat them harshly, if you in any way physically harm them, they can walk out. And it, of course, it encouraged them both to work with each other. So these are the unique laws for Hebrew servants. They couldn't be beaten or harmed. For debts or loans, the maximum term was 6 years. Debts were cancelled in the 7th. And then we come to this incredible section in Deuteronomy 15 in verse 12 to 18 of what happens when the time of service is finished. Now, we read in verse 12, he shall go free from there. It wasn't just a matter of saying, well, there, thank you, you've done your time, the 7th year's come around, there's the gate, see you later. It wasn't like that. What it says in verse 13, when you send him away from you, you shall not let him go away empty. You think about it. This man's been off his inheritance for perhaps 5 years. Maybe that inheritance hasn't been properly pruned, sown, farmed, ploughed. What's he going to do when he gets back? There's maybe no crops to be had. It might take him a year or more to get the crops again up to speed. He's got to buy farm animals. How is he going to re-establish his farm when he's been working for you for maybe 5 years? Well, this is how he does it. When he goes away in the 7th year, not only is the debt cancelled, it says there in verse 14, you shall furnish him liberally out of your flock and your threshing floor and your winepress. You can imagine the scenario. A man's worked for you for 5 years. He's got his wagon ready packed to go. And you say to him, go out there and pick the best of my flock. And he might take your best breeding stock. He goes into your barn and he takes bags of wheat and grain to get him through the next year. He goes into your wine press and he takes some skins of wine to get him through until he can grow his own. And you've got to say, take it. Yes, I'm glad to see you have it. How could you actually do that willingly? Well, as always in these things where generosity is required in the law of Moses, it comes back to the same thing. In verse 15, you shall remember that you were a bondman in Egypt and God redeemed you. And that's why at the end of verse 14, as God has blessed you, you shall give to him. So you encourage him to take as much as he can load onto his wagon, that he might get through the next year until his own crops come back into being. And it was remarkable. He was sent away with all these goodies. And, it was because you remembered God was with you. And you can imagine, again, the legalistic Jew coming to terms with the phrase liberally in verse 14. Furnish him liberally. And they would say, give me a number. How many bags of wheat? How many wineskins? No, you furnish him liberally as you realise God has blessed you. What an onus that put upon the person who'd been looking after this servant for that time. And it goes on to say, there was the case of the man who wanted to stay. We'll talk about him a bit more later on, but somebody could decide to stay in that house and to become a permanent servant. But it was incredibly impressed upon the Jews that servants, their Hebrew brethren, had to be well treated. They could not be oppressed, they could not be overworked, and they could not be treated with rigor. So they were servants. Now, this is how different was service in Israel compared to modern slavery. And of course, when I say modern slavery, not only did slavery exist in the 17th and 18th centuries and the 19th century in the USA and the West Indies, slavery exists today in many parts of the world, and there are still people being captured and sold as slaves all across the world. And those people have no rights, they have no pay and no end in sight for their service. So this is the difference for the Hebrew brother. And this, of course, also applied to the non-Hebrews who wanted to participate in Israel's worship. Servants were always included in the family worship. So when it went time to go to the feast, when it was some family worship around in the local synagogue, the servants were included. So on a spiritual plane, they were equal, absolutely equal to the person who was paying off their debt. They always had the day off. Even maidservants had the day off. And incredibly, that was that every servant wasn't working 7 days a week. They had a day of rest like the animals and like the workers in the field. Everybody had the Sabbath day off. They could marry others in the master's house. So while they were there in service, if they wanted to marry someone in that house, then they could do so. You know what happened in America, of course, that normally it was the slave owners decided who could marry who. And often people were sold into horrible bondage, sexual bondage in those days. Servants could elect to stay with their master at the end of their term. And the fact that this actually happened showed that there was a good and loving relationship had developed. This man says, I love my master. I'm happy working here. I'm one of those people that's not good at farming. I'd be better off working for somebody else. And so that man would elect to stay with his master. And when that happened, then we know what happened. There was a public ceremony. And you might say, oh, how cruel is this? But no, that public ceremony was that everybody would know that this man had gone through this painful process to voluntarily declare that he wanted to work and stay with that employer for life. And once he was committed, then his family would have to take over his inheritance and farm it. But here was a man declaring in public that he wanted to be part of this master's house. And it protected the master from a charge that he had forced this man into it. To go through that process was painful. And it was, of course, putting your ear to the wall and having it pierced through. And it was just showing that everybody knew that you decided to stay because you wanted to. Okay, well, I want you to notice the special care for maidservants. And if there's anyone that was vulnerable as a servant in a house, it's a maidservant. You only got to, if you're familiar at all with what happens in the Middle East today with many of the Asian servant girls who go there to work, their lot is terrible, and they are often treated as sexual slaves. And God gave laws about maidservants that were incredibly strict. They're uniquely prescribed for. So often through the laws of Moses, you get mention about maidservants because they were the most vulnerable. They could not be mistreated physically or harmed. Men were not to lust after the maidservants, and it was forbidden for men to treat them as a sexual object and to have a power imbalance that they could actually force these maidservants into sexual activity. They were specifically included in all the feasts and family worship. So every time God said, you've got to keep a feast, don't forget your maidservant has to go too. They were required to keep the Sabbath. And the laws of release included women, look at verse 12 here. A Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman be sold unto you. And this is where the feminists have got it so wrong. God always included women when it came to spiritual matters. And these was a case where the women were also included in the laws of release, unless you were married in the family of the creditor. And of course, there were provisions for some girls in service to marry into that household. And that's another subject. Okay, well, what about the foreign servants? Well, in ancient times, if you were a captive in war, you were probably killed because you remained a danger, or you became unpaid slaves with no rights. How the Roman Empire treated their slaves, they built the roads, they built the buildings, they were put to service 7 days a week, and sometimes they were used in the theatre as things for animals to kill. So the lot of a person who was captured in war was not always very good. So if you then said, look, I'm happy to become a bondservant in Israel, it was much better than death or starvation or whatever might happen once you've lost the war. Couldn't include the Canaanites. Distant nations could do it. They had to be well treated. And God said it's the same thing. Just because they're foreigners and just because they're working for you, it means you have the right to mistreat them. And they have to be well treated just as your Hebrew servants are. And if they converted to Judaism, then they could partake of the feast and the worship as we know the Nethinims later did. And it's interesting, isn't it, how the foreign servants could become part of Israel. And most foreign servants would realize they were on a much better thing in Israel than where they were back in their home countries or dead. So Jews could have Gentile servants. These were people spared in war or willing immigrants to Israel. They couldn't own Jewish land. They had to work for their living. Runaway slaves had to be protected, could not be sent back to their masters. How different that was to the bounty hunters that were in America that mutilated the runaway slaves. You mistreat any servant, whether he's a foreign servant or a Hebrew brother, he can go free, which made it, of course, necessary to treat your slaves well. Always the principle applied. Remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. And that, of course, is the way that God motivates all of us to treat our brethren properly and to forgive and to show grace to each other, because we always remember what God has done for us. Well, what about these non-Jewish workers? These were people who had particular skills and were bought from other nations. So you might go across to Moab and say, look, you've got a man here who's got the skill I need for my business. You pay a price for him, he becomes property. So inevitably you pay for him, he's worth something to you. If he was accidentally killed, then you were recompensed for the economic loss incurred. It doesn't mean that this is slavery of the American type. It means that this was somebody you'd paid to bring into your service. What is critical is you could not on-sell them. So having paid for them, you either kept them in service, you treated them well, you paid them an appropriate wage. You couldn't on-sell them to somebody else. You could say in the end, look, I've got no further need for you, or I don't need you anymore, you can go and find another job, but you couldn't on-sell them. So all the Jewish laws about the fair treatment and care for slaves and strangers applied to them, and therefore their life was very much better than it would be in other countries. And so again, Israel was the place to be if you were a non-Jewish worker. They were treated exceptionally well. Care for strangers was always encouraged. God said of this about strangers, he shall dwell with thee even among you in that place where he shall choose any one of thy gates. Where it likes him best, you shall not oppress him. So any stranger or immigrant who came to Israel could actually select where he would live and whom he would work for, because obviously they had to work because they couldn't own land, but they couldn't be oppressed. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. Treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. And again, this thoughtfulness, because of the recognition of what God has done for us, is the critical factor in the way we treat other people. So just to summarize, slavery in the New Testament is another topic. We need to recognize that slavery was a fact of life in the Roman Empire into which Christ came. Jesus came to give us the principles of individual salvation. It was not yet the time for Jesus to take on the world and to change the values of the world. And slavery is one of those things that actually existed when he came. So his goal was not the immediate transformation of the present evils of society, but the personal transformation of believers, and that is still going on now. Slavery still exists in the world. The time will come when it will be totally and utterly abolished. So it was a reality in the first century. They had to work around it. And Paul's advice was to the slaves and to the slave masters that they think about each other's position. And the truth, of course, became a factor in this. And you can imagine that people like Philemon, who obviously owned slaves like Onesimus, would not only treat their slaves well because of what they read in the Old Testament, but when they became brethren, would be very inclined to free them, if at all possible, and certainly would treat them very much more like equals than like those slaves were usually treated. So the truth impacted upon those who were in the brotherhood as to the way they would relate. Now, you might notice back in Deuteronomy 15, there's a little statement there which God just built into the record. It says in verse 18, "It shall not seem hard unto you." So being generous was not to be hard. Why? Because he hath been worth a double hired servant to you. And that's a little subtle message to the person who has gone into service to pay off his debts, that he should work twice as hard for his Hebrew brother as a paid servant would. And it's just interesting, isn't it? God on both sides of the question gives the motivation for people to look after each other's interests. So if you've gone into service, you're working for a Hebrew, you work twice as hard as anyone else. If you're the master who's taken somebody on, then you're very generously furnish him when he leaves, and you look after him while he's there. And it's always this God consciousness that is encouraged in the law of Moses, in the laws about service, and those who even came from outside had to be treated well. I want to just cover one more issue, and that is the issue of inheritances. And every Jewish family was given an inheritance that they should live on with their God. And God said, you cannot sell your inheritance. You cannot sell it forever, for the land is mine and you are strangers and sojourners with me. So it was God's land. God wanted to share it with them. But if you got into debt, you could mortgage it. It couldn't be sold forever. You could sell it for a time. God said, if you live in a city, I don't care what you do with your house in the city, because I don't like cities anyway, but you can't sell farmland forever. So they could only mortgage their land in cases of extreme poverty. And it went back to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. So again, there was a limited time that it could be mortgaged. If you wanted to go into this situation, then the buyer who was paying off your debts or giving you a loan would work out how many years were left that he could produce from that land. And then you would work for him as a paid servant on your land, and he would pay off your debt or your problem, whatever it was you needed to do this. God always encouraged the relatives of the person in debt to redeem the land. And there was always this encouragement for redemption from the family to make sure this person didn't have to stay in service until the year of Jubilee. And so relatives were encouraged to redeem them and to pay it out. Particularly if it was in the hand of Gentiles, then relatives really should get in there and make sure this didn't go on. So again, there was this preserving of the inheritance that was there. The very minimal thing God said, if you can't afford to get him out of debt and redeem his land, then you've got to make sure that he's treated well. And when he's in the hands of a Gentile, you've got to be on the case to make sure that he doesn't get treated badly in your sight. And they had to look after that person, even in a situation of, serious mortgage to a non-Jew. So, God provided for every stage of people being carefully looked after and provided for in their times of service. And they would work for the lender in those days. So in summary, God is not a moral monster. God is not a vicious God. God is a creator who has the prerogative to choose who he will choose and to remove the wicked when he chooses to do so. But God does not accept slavery of the kind that existed centuries ago and exists today in the world. Our God is a wonderful God. So we read in Deuteronomy 10 these words, "And now, Israel, what doth Yahweh thy God require of thee but to fear Yahweh thy God, to walk in all his ways and to love him, and to serve Yahweh thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. Every one of God's laws had a positive outcome, whether it be health laws, whether it be the regulation of crime, whether it be the provisions for service. Behold, the heaven and the earth of the heavens is Yahweh thy God's, the earth also and all that therein is. Only Yahweh had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all people, as it is this day. So let us completely refute the ill-informed and pernicious blasphemy of the four horsemen and the skeptics against the Bible, and make sure that we have ready some answers. And people bring up these challenges to say, well, look at the Bible, it's full of slavery and God condones slavery, that we can actually say, no, that's not the case. And we can actually give an answer of the hope that is within us.